a practical guide on AML risk assessment and monitoring program in 2026. My name is Evdokia Pitsillidou, and I am the Global Chief Risk and Compliance Officer and Partner at SALVUS. Throughout this course, we will focus on practical knowledge that supports licensing, compliance, and internal audit responsibilities, with a particular emphasis on anti-money laundering risk assessment and the design of an effective AML monitoring program. Let's begin by looking at what this workshop includes, so you know exactly what to expect from this learning experience. This workshop includes video recordings, which are always available online. This means that you can study at different times of the day and at your own rhythm, depending on your schedule and your learning preferences. You will also have access to self-study material for revision and preparation, which can be reviewed online through our platform or printed for offline studying. In addition, the workshop includes test questions for self-assessment at key points throughout the course. These test questions are designed to help you identify the areas that may require a revisit, so you can strengthen your understanding before moving forward. Now that we have seen what the workshop includes, let's move on to what you will gain through this learning journey. The workshop contents are structured to guide you through the key areas of AML risk assessment and monitoring. We will begin with money laundering, terrorist financing, and the AML framework so that the regulatory and conceptual basis is clear from the start. We will then move to anti-money laundering risk assessment, where we will examine how AML risks are identified, assessed, and managed. The course will also cover the anti-money laundering function, focusing on the responsibilities, duties, and practical role of the AML function within a regulated entity. We will then discuss the features of an anti-money laundering monitoring program and how such a program should be structured and implemented. Another important part of the workshop is the review of anti-money laundering inspection areas, which will help you understand what regulators may focus on during inspections. We will also examine good and bad practices based on Circular C656. To support your learning, there will be test questions to self-assess and measure the knowledge acquired. Finally, upon completion of the workshop, participants will receive certification of 5 hours of CPDs. Now that the overall structure is clear, let's take a moment to see how the learning platform supports your experience throughout the course. Welcome to this section of the course, Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing, and the AML Framework. This section is important because before we can properly understand AML risk assessment and AML monitoring programs, we first need to understand the core concepts and the regulatory environment behind them. Let's begin by looking at the topics that will be covered in this section. In this section, we will cover a number of important topics. First, we will look at what money laundering is. We will then examine the phases or stages of money laundering, together with examples that help explain how these stages may appear in practice. After that, we will look at what terrorist financing means. We will then compare money laundering and terrorist financing by identifying their differences, and then we will also look at their similarities. The section will also introduce CySEC as the supervisory authority, and we will discuss the powers of the supervisory authority. Finally, we will go through the AML regulatory framework so that we understand the main European directives and national laws that shape AML and CFT obligations. Now that we have the roadmap for this. So, what is money laundering? The term money laundering, or ML, refers to any type of income derived from an illegal act or from a legal act which is subsequently not declared in violation of existing tax legislation. In both cases, the act is considered a financial crime and the income is derived from illegal activities. This is an important point to understand from the beginning. Money laundering does not only relate to funds generated from obviously criminal activity, it may also involve income that was originally generated through a legal activity, but then becomes problematic because it is not declared properly, for example, in violation of tax legislation. In both situations, the issue is that the funds are connected with illegal activity or financial crime. With this basic definition in mind, let's now look more closely at what money laundering actually tries to achieve. Welcome to this section of the course, Anti-Money Laundering Risk Assessment. In the previous section, we introduced money laundering, terrorist financing, and the AML framework. Now we will take the next step and focus on the AML risk assessment itself. This is a very important part of the AML framework because it helps the AML function understand where the main risks are, how resources should be allocated, and how monitoring should be structured. Let's begin by looking at the contents of this section. In this section, we will cover three main areas. First, we will look at the purpose of the AML risk assessment. This will help us understand why the AML function performs this assessment and how it supports the effective allocation of resources. Second, we will look at the objectives of the AML risk assessment. This will allow us to understand what the assessment is expected to evaluate and which areas should be taken into account. Third, we will examine the influence of the AML risk assessment. Now, forming an AML risk assessment. The AML function undertakes an AML risk assessment to ensure the efficient allocation of its resources and to ensure that AML risk is comprehensively monitored. So, how does the AML risk assessment support this? The AML risk assessment determines the focus of the monitoring, advisory, and assistance activities of the AML function. This means that the assessment helps decide what should be monitored, where advice may be needed, and where assistance should be provided within the firm. Now that we understand why the assessment is performed, let's consider how often it should be reviewed and why this review is important. Welcome to this section on the anti-money laundering, or AML function. In this part, we will focus on the role of the AML function within the firm, including its responsibilities, organizational requirements, monitoring obligations, and key practical questions. This section builds directly on the AML risk assessment because the AML function is responsible for applying, monitoring, and supporting the firm's AML framework. Next, we'll focus on the contents of this section. In this section, we will cover the levels of control, the responsibilities of the AML function, and the requirements of effectiveness, permanence, and independence. We will also look at organizational requirements, monitoring obligations, and AML function questions and answers. These topics will help us understand where the AML function sits within the firm, what it is expected to do, and how it supports AML compliance in practice. With this structure in mind, we'll start with the levels of AML control framework is structured around three levels of control. Level 1 includes the business units such as front office and sales. These business units own the risk, apply KYC and CDD, and identify suspicious transactions. Level 2 includes the compliance and AML function. This level develops policies and procedures, performs the AML risk assessment, monitors controls and remediation, and reports to the board and senior management. Level 3 is internal audit. Internal audit is a fully independent body, reviews the effectiveness of AML controls and governance, and reports directly to the board. This structure helps separate ownership, monitoring, and independent review. From here, we move into the responsibilities of the AML, compliance, and risk management functions as the second level of control.